The narrow cobblestone streets of Lübeck, West Germany, wind their way between centuries-old buildings and quiet canals. In the late 1970s, this picturesque town carried with it a comforting predictability, the kind of place where people knew each other by name, and neighbors nodded with familiar smiles. It was in this quiet, almost timeless setting that Marianne Bachmeier was raising her young daughter Anna. To the world, Marianne was an ordinary woman. She was in her late 20s, with striking, serious eyes and a hardened but not unfriendly expression that suggested she had seen her share of struggle. Her life had been anything but simple, but from the outside, she appeared to be doing her best, working when she could, parenting always, and finding moments of peace in the company of her daughter. Their apartment wasn't much, modest and tucked away on a quiet street. But to Marianne and Anna, it was home. Marianne was born on June 3, 1950, into a post-war Germany still grappling with reconstruction and trauma. Her childhood was marked by instability, though she rarely spoke about it. Friends and later journalists would describe her as independent to a fault. Someone who trusted few, relied on even fewer, and had learned early that the world didn't offer safety without a cost. By her mid-20s, she had experienced a failed marriage, and the father of her daughter was no longer in the picture. She was, in every way, a single mother, emotionally, financially, and practically. Still, what she lacked in support, she made up for in determination. Her days were structured around Anna, making sure she was dressed and fed before school, walking her to the gate each morning, and listening to her little stories in the evening. Marianne did what many single mothers do, worked part-time jobs, managed bills creatively, and leaned on no one. Anna Bachmeier, only 7 years old at the time of her death, was the centerpiece of Marianne's world. She was a curious, outspoken, and headstrong little girl, the kind of child who asked hard questions and didn't shy away from adults. Teachers remembered her as bright, sometimes mischievous, but always engaged. She had a sharp tongue for someone her age and a tendency to challenge authority in a way that was both frustrating and endearing. Anna was a child of contradictions. She could be moody and impatient one moment, then compassionate and deeply thoughtful the next. Her laugh was loud, her opinions louder. Marianne often described her as stubborn like me, with a flicker of pride in her voice. Despite the hardships of their home life, there was warmth between them. Late-night chats in bed, shared meals in the tiny kitchen, the simple routine of life built around love. Their apartment bore signs of Anna's presence, stickers on the wall, drawings taped to the refrigerator, small toys scattered in odd corners. Their life together wasn't ideal. Money was always tight, and Marianne often struggled to juggle parenting with work. But they had forged something stable, even meaningful. They had rituals. Thursday nights were always for pancakes. Sundays meant a walk through the city center, sometimes ending with a scoop of ice cream or a cheap toy from a street vendor. These little things, Marianne would later say, were what she held on to. But life has a way of shifting without warning. Beneath the surface of normalcy, there were stresses. Marianne had a temper, something that would come up again later. Some said she was impulsive. Others claimed she was simply worn down by life. The daily grind, the lack of help, the pressure of parenting alone. She had tried dating again, but few relationships lasted. Trust didn't come easily. And yet, she never took her burdens out on Anna. Their bond, even amid all of life's instability, remained unshaken. In a quiet town like Lübeck, crime was rare. and especially crimes against children. Parents felt relatively safe, letting their children walk short distances alone. Anna, like most kids her age, wanted more independence. She didn't want to be walked to school anymore. "I'm not a baby," she had said one morning, planting her feet stubbornly in the hallway. Marianne, torn between her protective instincts and Anna's desire to grow up, relented. Just a few blocks, she thought. What could happen? In hindsight, it's easy to dissect the cracks in the system. The early warnings that were ignored, the oversights by authorities, the chances missed. But in that moment, Marianne was just another mother trying to balance safety with freedom. Letting go, just a little, is part of parenting. By all appearances, their life continued as normal. Photos from that period show Anna smiling awkwardly at the camera, her hair in a mess, her eyes gleaming with that mix of innocence and mischief. Marianne looks more serious, always, as if the camera caught her in a moment of worry. Perhaps it did. She worried often, about bills, about work, about whether she was doing it right. Still, life moved on. There was school, homework, grocery runs. They weren't planning for anything special. There were no big trips or events on the horizon, just ordinary days strung together. Ordinary, precious, fleeting. On the morning of March 5th, 1980, nothing seemed unusual. It was a Wednesday, cool and overcast. Anna left for school with her bag over her shoulder. Marianne watched her go, as she often did, standing in the doorway for a few seconds longer than usual. It was the last time she would ever see her daughter alive. The rest of the day unraveled in pieces, first with concern, then panic, then a nightmare that refused to end. When Anna didn't return home on time, Marianne called around, asked neighbors, contacted the school. The calls to the police began not long after. By that evening, search parties were being discussed. Posters were printed, questions asked. But the fear had already sunk in. Something was wrong. In the span of a single afternoon, everything changed. The town of Lübeck would never be the same. Marianne Bachmeier's life would split in two, before March 5th and everything after. The woman she was in the days before Anna's disappearance, tired, loving, fragile, and determined, would be replaced by someone else. Someone who would later become infamous, not just in Germany, but around the world. But before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the gunshots, there was this: a mother and her daughter, living together in a small apartment, making pancakes on Thursdays, walking to school, sharing jokes and arguments and love. There was nothing sensational about them, nothing that foretold what was to come. And perhaps that's what made the tragedy so devastating. They were just like anyone else. The name Klaus Grabowski would for years evoke a shudder in Lübeck and throughout Germany. But long before he became the man who changed Marianne Bachmeier's life forever, he was already known to the police. Not as a one-time offender or troubled man in need of guidance, but as a dangerous, repeat predator with a long and disturbing history of targeting children. What happened to Anna Bachmeier was not the result of a sudden, unpredictable act. It was a tragedy years in the making, a failure of the system to protect the most vulnerable. Born in 1946, Klaus Grabowski came of age during a turbulent time in post-war Germany. Details of his childhood remain murky, but what is clear is that from a young age, he displayed deeply troubling behavior. His record with law enforcement began in his teens, and by the time he reached adulthood, his crimes had escalated in both frequency and severity. Grabowski had a documented history of child molestation. He wasn't just suspected. He had been caught, tried, and convicted multiple times. In the early 1970s, he was arrested and convicted for sexually abusing several young girls. The cases were graphic and disturbing. It wasn't a matter of a single lapse in judgment or an isolated crime. Grabowski was a serial offender, someone who preyed on children, often those he knew or had easy access to. The legal system recognized this. He was labeled dangerous. He was diagnosed with pedophilic tendencies. And yet the path that followed was filled with missteps. After his convictions, Grabowski was offered a controversial medical option: chemical castration. At the time, Germany allowed certain convicted sex offenders to voluntarily undergo hormone treatments that would suppress their sexual urges. Grabowski agreed. He received hormone injections designed to reduce his testosterone levels and inhibit sexual functioning. For a time, it seemed the system had found a solution. But the effect wasn't permanent. In a bizarre and ultimately disastrous twist, Grabowski later sought to reverse the castration. Claiming he was experiencing depression and emotional instability due to the hormone suppression, he petitioned to stop the treatment. With the approval of a physician, he began hormone therapy that reactivated his sexual function. The predator had been rearmed, not by a mistake in prison, but by a legal, medical process intended to rehabilitate. That decision would prove fatal, not to him but to others. Psychologists who later reviewed his case painted a chilling picture. Klaus Grabowski wasn't just a sick man. He was manipulative, calculating, and emotionally erratic. He knew how to present himself in ways that appeared compliant or rehabilitated. He could mimic remorse. He could follow the rules, at least on paper. But his mind remained twisted by deviant desires. In therapy, he showed signs of narcissism and antisocial tendencies. He lacked empathy. He displayed a tendency to blame his victims, minimizing his own responsibility. Despite these red flags, Klaus Grabowski was released. He returned to civilian life, not in isolation, not under heavy supervision, but to a modest home in Lübeck, where children lived in nearby houses and where no visible warning signs alerted neighbors to the danger next door. The state had effectively handed him another chance, and a second chance to do terrible harm. Perhaps most unsettling was the fact that Grabowski was not living alone. At the time of Anna Bachmeier's murder, he was in a relationship with a woman named Ruth D. Some reports referred to her as his fiancée, though the nature of their relationship was complex. Ruth was aware of his past. She knew about his prior convictions, his time in prison, and the hormone treatments. And yet, late, she chose to remain by his side, not just as a partner, but in a way as an enabler. Together, they lived in an apartment that occasionally housed foster children and neighborhood kids. This detail would later ignite public outrage. How could a known child molester, someone with a documented and repeated history, be allowed anywhere near children again? Why weren't the authorities monitoring him more closely? How could a man like Klaus Grabowski be permitted to live an ordinary life after committing such heinous acts? Grabowski, despite his criminal record, presented himself as reformed. He found ways to integrate back into society. But those who interacted with him often described a sense of unease. He was quiet but intense, with eyes that didn't match the calmness of his words. Some neighbors later admitted that they felt something was off. But no one imagined he would kill a child, not again. Because, tragically, this was not Grabowski's first brush with deadly consequences. Years earlier, before Anna, he had kidnapped 2 young girls. They survived, but the trauma endured. At one point, after being caught again, he narrowly escaped harsh sentencing due to legal technicalities. A pattern was emerging: arrest, brief punishment, early release, and then repetition. His psychological profile was well known to law enforcement. Yet the warnings were ignored, downplayed, or dismissed. Klaus wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. He was a monster hiding in plain sight. It's important to understand that the case of Anna Bachmeier wasn't a random, one-off tragedy. It was the outcome of institutional neglect. Grabowski was supposed to be watched. His medical treatments should have been monitored. His relationships should have raised concerns, especially given his access to vulnerable children. But the bureaucracy moved slowly. The courts had done their part, and after a certain point, Grabowski was simply considered a free man. A man with second chances and no visible restraints. The final chain of events that led him to Anna would unfold swiftly. He met her near her school. Perhaps they had crossed paths before. Maybe he lured her with some offer. Candy, a pet, a friendly face. We may never know the exact method. What we do know is this: Anna was taken to his apartment, held against her will, and killed in a calculated, premeditated manner. Her death was not the result of a momentary loss of control. It was the final act of a predator who had been given too many chances. When Klaus Grabowski was arrested, the community was stunned. But for those who knew his past, there was also rage. People began to ask the questions that had been buried for years. Why wasn't he monitored more closely? Why had he been released? Why had medical professionals allowed his hormone therapy to be reversed without safeguards? Most damning of all, how many other children had suffered in silence? And could Anna's death have been prevented if someone, anyone, had paid closer attention? The answers were grim. The justice system had gambled on the possibility of rehabilitation. But Klaus Grabowski wasn't someone to be rehabilitated. He was someone who should have never been free again. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Anna's death was more than just a murder. It was a failure of an entire system. Marianne Bachmeier, mourning her daughter in silence, would come to represent not just personal grief, but public outrage. She wasn't the only one asking questions, but she would be the only one who would act on them in a way no one expected. That story, the one that would make headlines around the world, was still to come. For now, the focus remained on the predator who had taken Anna's life. A man whose name, face, and crimes would become synonymous with justice denied, and justice later taken by force. March 5th, 1980, began like any other day in the quiet town of Lübeck, West Germany. There was nothing in the air to suggest tragedy, no ominous signs, no warnings. The city's cobbled streets were alive with the routines of schoolchildren, workers, and shopkeepers. For 7-year-old Anna Bachmeier, it was a regular morning. School books packed, hair brushed by her mother, and the familiar promise of return that floats between parents and children every single day. But by dusk, that ordinary day would spiral into one of the darkest in Lübeck's modern history. A mother's worst nightmare would unfold in real time, and a predator would strike without resistance. Anna didn't want to go to school that day. It was a minor conflict at home, one that countless parents navigate. Marianne Bachmeier later recalled the moment vividly. Anna had had an argument with her mother. She wanted to skip school. Marianne insisted she attend. It was a tense, hurried exchange, the kind you regret only after it's too late. Eventually, Anna grabbed her things and left the apartment. She never came back, unbeknownst to her mother. Anna had stopped short of her classroom. Whether it was frustration, distraction, or something else, she skipped school that day. No teacher called home. No alarm was raised. She simply vanished into the streets of Lübeck, unaccounted for and unprotected. At some point during that morning, Anna crossed paths with Klaus Grabowski. The 35-year-old sex offender lived not far from the Bachmeier home. He knew the neighborhood. He likely knew Anna by sight, if not by name. What is terrifying is how effortlessly he could operate, without suspicion, without alert. That morning, Klaus was not lurking in shadows or donning a disguise. He was just there. The exact method he used to lure Anna remains chillingly simple. He invited her to his apartment. No struggle, no force, just a quiet manipulation of trust. Perhaps he offered something, a cat to play with, candy, or a gentle smile. For a child, especially one momentarily rebelling against routine, such things can be dangerously persuasive. And Anna, tragically, followed. Inside the apartment, Anna entered a space that had already betrayed countless other children. This wasn't the first time Klaus had taken a girl behind closed doors. But this time, the outcome would be final. Living with Klaus at the time was his 18-year-old fiancée, Ruth D., a woman with a complicated and disturbing role in the tragedy. She wasn't a stranger to Klaus's past. She knew about his convictions. She knew he had been chemically castrated and later underwent hormone therapy to restore his sexual function, yet she stayed. Worse, she played a silent, complicit part in what was about to happen. Ruth was at the apartment that day. She saw Anna. She later admitted to speaking with the girl. She even helped dye Klaus's hair in the aftermath, a move that would later be interpreted as an attempt to alter his appearance and escape recognition. But on that day, March 5, she did nothing to stop what was unfolding. No screams, no police call, no intervention. Whether out of fear, control, or shared guilt, Ruth D. became a passive accessory to a horror that could have been interrupted. What happened next was both premeditated and cold-blooded. Once inside, Klaus kept Anna in the apartment for hours. He gave her food, let her pet his cats. It wasn't violent at first, at least not visibly. But it was a form of captivity. She wasn't allowed to leave. Then, at some point, the tone changed. Klaus feared going back to prison. He had already been there. He knew what would happen if he was caught with another girl. He also knew his parole terms strictly forbade contact with children. So he made a calculated decision. He called his parole officer, not to confess, but to test the waters. He hinted that he was in trouble. He asked vague questions. But the call wasn't specific enough, and no action was taken. It was a final chance for intervention that went tragically unheeded. Later that day, Klaus strangled Anna with one of his fiancée's tights. There were no signs of a struggle or cries for help. The act was clinical, methodical. He then placed her body into a large cardboard box, sealed it, and prepared to dispose of it like unwanted cargo. The next phase of the crime was just as chilling. Klaus and Ruth loaded the box into a bicycle trailer. They wheeled it several miles through town and eventually left it near a canal, beside a small embankment. It was a dump site, chosen not for secrecy, but convenience. He didn't bury her. He didn't even hide her well. The box sat there, waiting to be discovered. A silent testament to the brutality within. By nightfall, Anna's disappearance was noticed. When she didn't come home, Marianne Bachmeier knew something was wrong. It wasn't like Anna to vanish. Calls were made. Friends were questioned. A police report was filed. But the hours dragged on. The following day, March 6th, police located the box. It was a cardboard TV carton, nothing that screamed of horror on the outside. But inside was Anna. Her body curled, lifeless, discarded like an object. The sight was devastating. News of the discovery swept through Lübeck like wildfire. The town was in shock. A child stolen and murdered. And worse, murdered by someone who never should have been free. Police didn't take long to trace the crime back to Klaus Grabowski. His prior record made him an immediate suspect. Witnesses had seen Anna near his building. It all pointed to him. When officers arrived at his home, they found enough evidence to make the arrest. He was calm, almost resigned. Ruth, too, was arrested for her involvement. Public reaction was immediate and fierce. Protesters gathered outside the police station. News outlets ran scathing reports. Headlines asked the same agonizing question. How could this happen again? For Marianne Bachmeier, the confirmation of Anna's death was not just heartbreaking, it was life-altering. In the hours that followed the discovery, she descended into a fog of grief, guilt, and rage. The final conversation she had with Anna haunted her. The argument, the insistence that she go to school, the belief that she was sending her daughter into safety. But the truth was harsher. She had unknowingly sent her into the hands of a monster who had been given too many second chances. In the days that followed, Klaus Grabowski's name became infamous. He was labeled a repeat offender, a failure of Germany's justice system, and the embodiment of evil. And yet, even as the trial loomed and the public demanded answers, Marianne was not content to simply watch justice unfold. Because in her eyes, there was no justice, only loss. The courts had failed to keep her daughter safe. And as she sat through the legal proceedings, reliving Anna's final moments, something in her shifted. But that reckoning, that explosion of personal and national grief, was still a few months away. For now, Germany was grappling with a tragedy that seemed both preventable and irreversible. Anna Bachmeier had vanished on a normal day, and that normal day became a national trauma. When police informed Marianne Bachmeier that her daughter's body had been found, something inside her broke permanently. The words felt distant, surreal, unfit for the real world. Anna, her curious and soft-spoken daughter, was gone, murdered, strangled, left in a cardboard box like garbage. Nothing could prepare a parent for this moment. But for Marianne, it wasn't just grief. It was a complete emotional collapse. She was taken to the morgue under sedation. Friends and family insisted she shouldn't see the body, but she demanded it. She needed to see Anna with her own eyes. Not to identify her, she already knew, but to say goodbye. The moment she stepped into the sterile, cold room and saw her daughter's lifeless form, something inside her screamed silently and endlessly. A scream she would carry for years. That image, she later said, never left her. Not in sleep, not in waking. It was burned into her mind. For days, Marianne couldn't eat, couldn't speak, couldn't sleep. The apartment they had once shared became a tomb. Anna's school books remained on the table, her shoes still by the door. And Marianne, a mother now, without a child, was left alone with the ghost of what had been and what would never be again. But as her grief simmered into fury, the world around her was already igniting. The public reacted to Anna's murder with outrage. Klaus Grabowski's name dominated headlines. Repeat offender kills again? Justice system fails child. Crowds gathered outside police stations and courthouses demanding reforms. Talk shows and newspapers dissected every detail. Klaus's criminal past, his hormone treatment, the judicial leniency that allowed him to live freely just blocks away from children. He had been convicted of sexually abusing multiple girls in the past. He had undergone chemical castration, but later sought hormone treatment to reverse it. Inexplicably, the courts approved it. Then he was released under parole with the condition that he never be near children. That condition, clearly, was not enforced. Everyone, police, judges, doctors, had a part in this failure. And now, a child was dead. But amidst the national outrage, Marianne faced an entirely different battle, one of betrayal and helplessness. When she tried to participate in the legal proceedings, she was treated not as a grieving mother, but as an observer. The system shut her out. Prosecutors advised her not to engage emotionally. Defense attorneys hinted that her daughter had made risky decisions. Court-appointed psychologists discussed Klaus's troubled childhood and his inner turmoil, painting him as damaged rather than monstrous. To Marianne, it all felt upside down. She sat in the courtroom day after day, forced to look at the man who had killed her daughter. Klaus Grabowski showed no signs of guilt. His demeanor was cold, almost clinical. He didn't avoid her eyes, but he didn't seek them either. He spoke when asked, answered questions plainly, and never once apologized. She watched as professionals debated whether he was criminally responsible, whether his past traumas reduced his accountability. The system, it seemed, was bending over backward to understand him, to analyze him, to potentially save him. Meanwhile, Anna's life was reduced to autopsy reports and legal arguments. Her name became a footnote. Her mother, an afterthought. What disturbed Marianne most was the courtroom's lack of humanity. She saw no compassion, no moral outrage from the system itself. It was sterile, procedural, emotionally detached. There were no tears, no acknowledgement of the hole left in her life. No one asked her about Anna's favorite bedtime story. No one talked about her laughter or the way she'd twirl in front of the mirror in her new dress. Everything felt mechanized. Justice, she realized, was more of a process than a principle. It wasn't built for emotion. It was built to move cases forward. And Klaus's defense didn't argue innocence. They argued mitigation. They brought up his own childhood abuse, his internal confusion, his gender identity struggles. They called him a man in conflict with himself, a victim of poor mental health care. A broken man, yes, but not an evil one. This was the tipping point for Marianne. She had already lost her daughter. But now, it felt like she was losing her right to rage, her right to demand punishment. The law was being used not to uphold morality, but to explain away horror. The more she sat in that courtroom, the more she felt the imbalance. She saw the system as one that protected predators under the guise of rehabilitation, while leaving victims' families to rot in silence. Marianne's friends noticed the change. She became quieter, colder. Her voice, once warm and assertive, took on a sharper edge. She stopped crying in public. The grief hardened. And behind her stillness, something began to take shape. A deep, growing belief that the system would never give her justice. She began researching cases like Klaus's. She spoke to other victims' families. She read about rehabilitation programs and parole failures. Every story added fuel to the fire. She didn't just see Klaus as Anna's murderer. She saw him as a symbol, a symptom of a diseased system. And like many mothers who endure the unendurable, she started to think not just like a grieving parent, but like someone preparing to act. In interviews years later, friends and acquaintances said Marianne was functioning but not living. They saw in her a woman frozen in time, March 5th, 1980 to be exact. The day Anna disappeared. And as the weeks passed and the trial dragged on, she stopped believing in the idea of legal closure. The pain was too large, the process too impersonal. The distance between the courtroom and justice, in her eyes, had become unbridgeable. And still Klaus remained composed. He never wept, never apologized, never acknowledged Marianne directly. For a man accused of murdering a 7-year-old girl, he showed no signs of inner torment. This haunted Marianne, not just because he had killed her daughter, but because he felt nothing afterward. That blankness, that lack of remorse, became the image she carried with her as the trial pushed forward. It didn't matter what sentence he received. It wouldn't bring Anna back. And more importantly, it wouldn't stop another child from being failed next time. In that sense, the system hadn't just failed once. It was still failing. Every day, Marianne Bachmeier had entered the courthouse believing in justice. She would leave it believing in vengeance. As spring settled over Lübeck in 1981, the city carried on as if nothing had happened. Children returned to school, couples resumed their routines, and the press, though quieter, still printed headlines about the upcoming trial of Klaus Grabowski. But behind one closed apartment door, a mother who had already endured the worst loss imaginable was quietly slipping into a state the system hadn't accounted for. Marianne Bachmeier was not doing well. Outwardly, she still appeared functional. She ran errands. She responded with short nods when neighbors offered condolences. She even managed brief conversations with acquaintances. But inside, she was crumbling. Her days were repetitive and hollow. Nights were worse. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Anna, alive, then dead. Dreams brought no peace. Even sleep betrayed her with flashes of memory, images of courtrooms, of Klaus, of Anna's little shoes lying at the doorstep, untouched since the day she disappeared. The world expected her to mourn and move on. But Marianne had no interest in healing. She didn't want closure. She wanted accountability. And she was slowly accepting the idea that no one was going to give it to her. As the trial date approached, she became more withdrawn. Every conversation with prosecutors left her colder. The words, "Justice will take time," rang hollow. Officials treated her more like a potential problem than a grieving parent. She was monitored closely, everyone aware she was deeply unstable, yet no one offering more than platitudes or empty reassurances. The press had also turned. In subtle ways, they began shifting the narrative. Klaus Grabowski, though undeniably guilty, was now being examined through the lens of psychological complexity. Was he a monster, or a man failed by society? One column asked. Another questioned whether chemical castration had distorted his emotional capacity. These articles enraged Marianne. Her daughter was gone, choked to death with a pair of tights, and the world wanted to understand him. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Marianne found herself spiraling. Her emotions were no longer predictable. Some days, she felt a wave of deep depression, incapacitating and still. Other days were filled with a rage so sharp it made her tremble. She stopped confiding in friends. She had no faith in psychologists. She told herself again and again, they don't get it. They can't. Then, sometime in late February 1981, something shifted. A thought she had pushed away for weeks took root. If the system won't deliver justice, maybe I have to. It wasn't an epiphany. It was more like a slow, deliberate crawl toward a decision. Marianne didn't wake up one morning with a plan. It unfolded over long, empty nights of staring at the ceiling and days filled with watching the clock tick while the world turned without Anna. She began inquiring quietly about guns. Germany had strict gun laws, but the black market existed. She didn't want anything large, just something small, concealable, something she could carry in her handbag unnoticed. She made discreet phone calls, traveled outside Lübeck to avoid attention. Finally, she found what she was looking for. A small caliber pistol, compact enough to fit inside a cloth purse. No registration, no questions. She brought the gun home, wrapped it in a towel, and placed it in the bottom drawer of Anna's dresser. For days, she didn't touch it. It was just there, an object of possibility. But every time she passed the drawer, her eyes would drift there. Was she really going to do it? The internal conflict was constant. One part of her still clung to law and logic. She had studied history in school. She believed in democracy. She had taught Anna the value of fairness. Could she really abandon all that? Become what she hated most? But the other part of her, larger now, kept screaming, "He doesn't deserve a trial. He murdered your child." He showed no remorse. And the system let it happen. In the mirror, she saw someone unrecognizable. Her face, once expressive, now seemed cold, focused. There was no more fear, no more indecision, only an eerie calm. As the trial date neared, Marianne rehearsed in her mind. She studied courtroom layout. She knew exactly where she'd sit. She observed which guards were posted where. The metal detector was faulty. Many people were waved through when it beeped. She knew the handbag she would use, how she would position it, how she would reach into it without drawing suspicion. There was no manifesto, no diary entries explaining her thoughts. She never confided in anyone. Not a single person knew what she was planning. That was intentional. If she succeeded, she wouldn't need to explain. If she failed, she'd already accepted the consequences. The night before the trial, Marianne barely slept. She sat in Anna's room, the gun now wrapped in a scarf inside her handbag. She stared at Anna's drawings on the wall. The dolls lined up under the window, her school bag still filled with pencils. She whispered to her daughter, softly, no big declarations, just a final promise. Mama's going to fix it. March 6th, 1981, the day of the trial. The weather was cold but clear. The courthouse in Lübeck was already bustling when she arrived. Journalists swarmed outside. Police checked documents. Inside, the hallways were noisy with legal teams, victims' advocates, and curious observers. Marianne walked in like everyone else. Her handbag passed through the security checkpoint without question. No one stopped her. No one noticed the stiffness in her walk, the tension in her fingers. She found her seat quietly. Second row, just behind the defendant's table. She knew Klaus would walk in soon. The courtroom itself had a strange stillness. A quiet hum of anticipation, legal jargon floating in the air, papers rustling. But Marianne heard none of it. Her hand rested gently on the scarf in her bag. Her heartbeat didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. Then Klaus entered. He was led by officers, as always, head down, composed. The same calm detachment he'd displayed throughout. He didn't glance at the audience. He sat down. The judge was not yet present. The room wasn't fully settled. And in that moment, before protocol resumed, before the law could speak, Marianne stood up. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She pulled the pistol from her bag with clinical precision, aimed directly at Klaus from behind, and fired. 7 times. March 6th, 1981, began like any other day inside the Lübeck District Court. The early spring air outside was cool but tolerable. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, laced with tension and quiet anticipation. Everyone knew what trial was about to begin. The murder of little Anna Bachmeier had shaken the city to its core. And now, the man responsible, Klaus Grabowski, was to face judgment in the court of law. Court staff went about their routines with brisk efficiency. Security checked identification, lawyers organized papers, and journalists scribbled notes, preparing to document the high-profile proceedings. A small audience gathered, mostly members of the public and press, seated quietly in the rows behind the courtroom railing. Among them was Marianne Bachmeier. She had arrived early, dressed modestly, her expression unreadable. No one suspected anything out of the ordinary. She had attended prior court hearings related to the investigation and had not caused any disturbances. Like any grieving mother, her presence felt appropriate, if not expected. But this day was different. At approximately 10 a.m., the trial of Klaus Grabowski was set to begin. Court officials moved about to finalize last-minute details. A few journalists whispered in the corner, cameras slung around their shoulders. The judge had not yet entered, and the room had not fully settled. Still, there was a subdued quietness, a breath being held collectively by everyone in the room. Then the defendant was brought in. Klaus Grabowski entered in handcuffs, escorted by 2 court officers. He was calm, as he had always appeared. His expression showed little emotion, no visible anxiety, no remorse, just the same flat stare he had worn throughout the investigation. He was led to the defendant's table and seated. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The back of his head faced the public benches, faced Marianne. What happened next unfolded in seconds, yet left an impression so deep it echoed across Germany. From her handbag, Marianne Bachmeier slowly pulled out a small pistol, concealed in a scarf until that moment. Without saying a word, without warning, she stood up, took aim at Klaus from behind, and opened fire. The first shot caught the room off guard. The sound of gunfire in a courtroom was unthinkable. Some screamed, others froze. Then came the second, third, fourth, until she had fired 7 rounds in total. Klaus Grabowski collapsed to the floor, blood pooling beneath his body. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Screams echoed off the walls. The judge, who had not yet formally started proceedings, ducked for cover. Court clerks and security guards scrambled. Journalists fell to the ground, some using chairs as shields, others fumbling for their cameras. The sharp smell of gunpowder mingled with the stunned silence that followed. And yet, in the center of it all, Marianne stood motionless, her arm lowered, the gun still in her hand. Her face was blank, eerily calm, as if all the energy and fury had left her body the moment she pulled the trigger. Security rushed in seconds later. Guns were drawn, but Marianne made no move to resist. She handed over the weapon quietly, allowed herself to be cuffed without a struggle. Not a word escaped her lips. A paramedic team attempted resuscitation on Klaus Grabowski, but it was futile. He was pronounced dead at the scene. One of the bullets had struck him in the back of the neck, killing him almost instantly. His body was removed as court officials secured the scene and evacuated the courtroom. Outside the courthouse, word spread like wildfire. Crowds had gathered already for the start of the trial, but within minutes, the media was reporting something far more explosive. The mother of the victim had just executed the accused murderer inside the courtroom. Television crews scrambled for footage. Reporters tried to get statements from anyone present. Police cordoned off the building, while inside, officers conducted a full sweep of the crime scene. Shell casings were collected. Witnesses were interviewed. The weapon, a small 5.6 mm pistol, was bagged and logged as evidence. Marianne Bachmeier was taken into custody immediately. She remained silent as she was led away, avoiding eye contact with anyone. But photographs taken of her that day would become iconic. Her blank expression, hair slightly disheveled, hands bound behind her back. She didn't look like a killer. She looked like a mother who had nothing left to lose. Reactions from the public were immediate and sharply divided. Some viewed Marianne as a vigilante hero, a woman who did what the justice system could not. Others criticized the breakdown of law and order, calling her actions reckless and dangerous. Legal analysts debated whether her mental state would play a role in her prosecution. Psychologists speculated on the extent of her trauma and whether she had premeditated the act or acted in a moment of emotional collapse. But one thing was clear. Marianne Bachmeier had shattered the illusion of courtroom control. In a space built to uphold law and order, she had brought chaos and vengeance. In the following hours, the courthouse was locked down. Investigators began compiling surveillance logs, statements, and procedural failures. How had a loaded weapon entered the courtroom undetected? Why hadn't security noticed anything suspicious? The incident triggered a national conversation on court safety and the emotional limits of victims' families. Inside her cell, Marianne was alone. She didn't ask for a lawyer right away. She didn't weep. She didn't speak. She simply sat on the narrow bench, staring ahead, as if her mission was complete. For the next few days, Germany was gripped by the story. News outlets ran dramatic headlines. Mother executes daughter's killer in courtroom. Justice or revenge. Germany reacts to vigilante killing, and the woman who took the law into her own hands. Politicians weighed in. Activists debated ethics. Psychologists were invited on talk shows. And through it all, one woman remained at the center. Silent, grieving, and now, a killer. Klaus Grabowski's body was buried quietly, with almost no mourners. Anna Bachmeier had died almost a year earlier. She never saw her 7th birthday. And Marianne Bachmeier had ensured that her child's murderer never lived to face trial. Marianne Bachmeier was still in her courtroom clothes when the police officially charged her with murder. After being arrested on March 6, 1981, she was taken directly from the Lübeck District Court to a nearby police station. The hallway lights were harsh. The questions began immediately. The officers tried to be clinical, detached, but they all knew who she was. Everyone did by then. In the interrogation room, Marianne sat calmly. She answered their questions without outbursts or dramatics. No tears, no remorse, just a quiet woman who had made a decision and followed through. The police documented everything: her demeanor, her statements, the weapon she used. She told them she had purchased the small pistol a few days prior. She had smuggled it into the courtroom in her handbag. She didn't deny what she had done, but she also didn't explain it in full. Her motivation was obvious to everyone, but officially, it had to be recorded, examined, and weighed against the law. Later that day, she was transferred to pre-trial detention. There, behind prison walls, Marianne would spend her nights awaiting the fallout of her decision. But on the outside, the real storm had already begun. News of the shooting spread like wildfire. By the next morning, every major German newspaper carried the story on its front page. "Mother shoots daughter's killer in courtroom," screamed one tabloid in bold black letters. Others used more restrained headlines, but all conveyed the same sense of stunned awe. The crime had shifted from personal tragedy to national sensation overnight. Television broadcasters aired breaking news bulletins. Radio hosts opened their shows with emotional commentary. In coffee shops, offices, and family homes across Germany, the story dominated conversation. The public response was immediate and deeply divided. One camp viewed Marianne as a tragic hero. To them, she was a mother who had watched the system fail her child and had taken justice into her own hands. Letters of support flooded in. Some sent flowers to her home, others called her brave. She did what any mother would do, they said. The other side wasn't so forgiving. Legal experts and public officials warned of the dangers of vigilante justice. They argued that allowing personal vengeance to override due process would erode the foundations of a civilized society. Some questioned how she was allowed to bring a loaded weapon into a courtroom in the first place. Others suggested her actions were premeditated and cold-blooded, no different than the man she had killed. The media capitalized on the split. Television specials began airing just days after the shooting. Headlines grew more sensational. Newspapers published photos of Marianne, both from her court arrest and older pictures of her with Anna. The contrast was striking. The tender mother and the courtroom shooter. She was no longer just a grieving parent. She was now a symbol, and everyone wanted to define what that symbol meant. Some outlets portrayed her as a martyr. Others labeled her a danger. Documentaries were proposed. Opinion pieces flooded editorial pages. In the span of a week, Marianne Bachmeier had gone from being a private citizen to a national fixation. The pressure was not limited to the media. The legal system was now under a microscope. The Ministry of Justice launched an internal inquiry into courtroom security failures. How had she smuggled the gun in? Why were security protocols so lax? What could have been done to prevent such a breakdown? Prosecutors, meanwhile, began preparing for a trial they never expected. The defendant would not be a career criminal or a repeat offender. She was a mother, an emotionally devastated woman who had lost her child in the most brutal way imaginable. But she had also taken a life in front of witnesses inside a courtroom. The charge was clear: intentional homicide. But how it would be argued and what defenses could be mounted remained uncertain. Her mental state, her emotional trauma, and the circumstances surrounding her act would all become central points in the courtroom to come. Her defense team faced an impossible balancing act. They couldn't deny what happened. It had all been public. What they needed to do was explain it, contextualize it, humanize her to the court, to the jury, and to the broader public still watching closely. Marianne's portrait began to emerge in more depth as journalists dug into her past. She wasn't a violent woman. She had no criminal record. Her life, until Anna's death, had been marked more by hardship than rebellion. Her upbringing had been turbulent, her relationships unstable. She had been a young single mother trying to provide a stable life for her daughter in Lubeck. As these details surfaced, some journalists softened their coverage. Others doubled down on the avenger angle. Some tried to maintain objectivity, but objectivity was in short supply. Marianne herself remained largely silent during this time. From prison, she gave no major interviews, no press conferences. The only words the public had from her were those written by others. Still, in the hearts of many, her story had struck a nerve. She was a portrait of human contradiction. Victim and aggressor, fragile and fearless, lawbreaker and justice seeker. By the end of the second week after the shooting, public opinion remained fiercely divided. But one thing was clear. Marianne Bachmeier was no longer just a mother. She was now a national symbol of grief, of rage, and of the terrifying power of love pushed beyond its limits. The trial of Marianne Bachmeier began in 1983, 2 years after she had pulled the trigger inside a Lubeck courtroom. What unfolded next was not a routine murder trial. It was a national spectacle. A grieving mother had taken justice into her own hands, and the legal system was now faced with a dilemma. Prosecute her as a murderer or understand her as a product of overwhelming trauma. From the very first day, it was clear that this was no ordinary courtroom proceeding. Security was tight. Journalists lined the steps of the courthouse. Television vans and reporters swarmed the area. Inside the courtroom, Marianne Bachmeier sat composed but weary. Her face showed exhaustion, not just from the weight of her actions, but from the long emotional burden she had carried since the murder of her daughter, Anna. The prosecution came in firm. They were determined to frame the case by the book. 7 shots, premeditated, executed in a courtroom. That, in the eyes of the law, was murder. The prosecutors painted Marianne not as a grieving mother, but as a citizen who had bypassed the justice system entirely. They emphasized that she had not acted on impulse. She had smuggled a pistol into the courthouse, waited for the exact moment, and opened fire in front of dozens of witnesses. They reminded the court that if vigilante justice was tolerated, the legal system would fall into chaos. They were not without sympathy, but they insisted that law must remain above emotion. For them, the case was clear. Marianne Bachmeier had committed murder in cold blood. But the defense had a different narrative, one rooted in psychological collapse and human pain. Her defense team argued that Marianne had endured severe psychological trauma. The murder of her daughter, the details of how Anna had been lured, strangled, and discarded, had left her emotionally destroyed. According to them, Marianne's mental state on the day of the shooting was not stable. They presented her as a mother, not a criminal. Someone who had lost faith in a system that allowed a known child molester to roam free and eventually take the life of her only child. They argued that her actions were the result of a breakdown, not cold planning. That she was pushed to the edge by a system that failed to protect her daughter and showed no sign of remorse for her loss. To support the defense's argument, expert witnesses were called in. Psychologists and psychiatrists testified about Marianne's mental condition. They spoke of her extreme grief, her symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and her growing sense of helplessness. According to several experts, Marianne was not in a rational state of mind when she brought the weapon to the courtroom. She was acting under the weight of unbearable emotional pain. The courtroom witnessed tense and emotional moments. At one point, a psychologist described in detail how mothers of murdered children often experience a unique kind of trauma, a collapse of personal identity, a loss of trust in institutions, and a deep, unrelenting sense of guilt. Marianne sat silently during these descriptions, her expression distant. Witnesses were called, friends, former neighbors, even local journalists, who spoke about how Marianne had changed after Anna's death. Some described her as a quiet, reserved woman who had become withdrawn and emotionally fragile. Others recalled her mentioning, in passing, that the justice system couldn't be trusted to punish Klaus Grabowski. These testimonies further blurred the line between premeditated revenge and emotional breakdown. The prosecution, in response, tried to dismantle the narrative of emotional instability. They focused on the logistics of the shooting, how Marianne had acquired the weapon, how she had hidden it in her handbag, how she had waited for the right moment before firing. They presented these steps as evidence of planning. But the defense maintained that even if the act was planned, it was done under the fog of trauma, not rational calculation. The media coverage intensified with each passing day. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw Marianne as a murderer, someone who undermined the rule of law. Others viewed her as a tragic symbol, a mother whose suffering led her to an act that many secretly understood. The courtroom felt less like a legal chamber and more like a battleground of morality and emotion. After weeks of arguments, testimonies, and analysis, the trial neared its conclusion. The public held its breath. Would Marianne be sentenced as a cold-blooded killer? Or would the court recognize the deeper complexities of her case? On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Reporters scrambled for seats. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Marianne Bachmeier was found guilty of manslaughter and illegal possession of a firearm. The court acknowledged that her actions were unlawful, but also recognized the extraordinary psychological pressure she had endured. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison, a decision that sparked both relief and outrage across Germany. Supporters believed the court had shown compassion. Critics said the sentence was too light for someone who had killed in cold blood. Marianne would go on to serve 3 years before being released. During those years, she remained mostly out of public view, declining interviews and choosing silence over publicity. But the case of Marianne Bachmeier had already etched itself into legal and cultural history. She was no longer just a grieving mother or a courtroom shooter. She had become a symbol of a society torn between law and human pain, between justice and vengeance. When Marianne Bachmeier walked out of prison after serving 3 years, she entered a world that had not forgotten her, but had moved on in many ways. Her release did not come with celebration, nor was it met with hostility. Instead, it was a quiet transition, one befitting a woman who had once shocked the world, but now wanted only to disappear from it. She was free, but freedom for Marianne did not bring peace. The years behind bars had done little to ease the emotional damage. The murder of her daughter, the public nature of her own crime, and the relentless media attention had left deep scars. She emerged into a Germany that still remembered her name, still remembered the courtroom, the gunshots, and the face of a grieving mother. Marianne knew that staying in Lübeck would never allow her to rebuild her life. The city, once the backdrop of her quiet family life, now held only painful reminders. So, she left. In the early 1990s, she moved to Nigeria, where she married a teacher. It was a surprising and quiet choice. Far from the media, far from Germany, far from the memory of Klaus Grabowski and Anna. The move seemed like an attempt to rewrite the narrative of her life, to find a new identity in a different culture. But the peace was temporary. Her marriage did not last long. Cultural differences, unresolved trauma, and internal restlessness made it difficult for her to settle. After a few years, she left Nigeria and moved once again, this time to the United States. Her life in America was even more private. She avoided public appearances and refrained from discussing her past. The few who knew her during this time often described her as distant, guarded, and deeply introspective. She took small jobs, tried to blend into society, and avoided drawing attention to herself. For many years, she remained a ghost to the German press. A woman whose story had once dominated headlines, now vanished from public life. Yet, even in self-imposed exile, Marianne couldn't fully escape the weight of her past. In rare interviews during this period, carefully chosen and spaced years apart, she spoke with a mixture of regret and defiance. She acknowledged the impact of her actions, but never fully renounced them. In one such interview, she said, "I wanted to kill him. I wanted to destroy him. I know it was wrong, but I also know what I lost. And no one can understand that unless they have lost a child like I did." These statements revealed a woman still at war with herself. Someone who knew she had committed a crime, but also believed it was the only form of justice she had left. Her reflections were raw, complex, and never polished for public approval. She did not seek forgiveness, nor did she ask for sympathy. Instead, she carried her burden quietly. Over time, mental health struggles became more pronounced. Years of grief, trauma, and internal conflict left Marianne emotionally fragile. According to people close to her, she suffered from depression and periods of deep withdrawal. She avoided large social gatherings and kept a limited circle of contacts. The world saw less and less of her as time went on. By the late 1990s, Marianne Bachmeier returned to Germany, though not immediately to Lübeck. Her later return to her hometown came with hesitation. She knew that Lübeck was still haunted by her story, that for many, her name was still tied to courtroom vengeance and national debate. Yet, it was also the city where Anna had lived, where memories of her daughter lingered in familiar streets, parks, and corners. Marianne eventually settled back into a quiet life in Lübeck. She rarely appeared in public. Her name would occasionally surface in retrospectives, documentaries, or legal discussions. She remained a subject of debate in criminal justice circles, especially when discussions about vigilante justice or emotional duress came up. But Marianne herself stayed mostly silent. In her final years, isolation and illness took hold. She was diagnosed with cancer, a battle she fought quietly and without much public notice. Even in sickness, she chose solitude over attention. Friends and acquaintances say she spent much of her time reading, writing, and reflecting. Some believe she was working on a manuscript or personal memoir, though nothing was ever officially published. Marianne Bachmeier passed away on September 17, 1996, at the age of 46. Her death, like much of her later life, was quiet. There were no public statements, no national mourning. Just a few headlines marking the end of a woman who had once stunned the world. Her story remained one of the most emotionally complex in German criminal history. To some, she was a criminal who undermined the justice system. To others, she was a broken mother who did what any parent might fantasize about, but never act on. To most, she was something in between. A reminder that justice and emotion are not always separate paths. Even in death, Marianne's legacy sparked conversations. Her act in that courtroom in 1981 continued to raise difficult questions. What happens when justice feels too slow? When the system protects the guilty but fails the innocent? Can grief ever justify violence? Those questions never had easy answers. And Marianne Bachmeier never pretended that her answer was the right one. Only the one she could live with. On September 17th, 2006, Marianne Bachmeier died in Lübeck, the same city where her life had been turned upside down more than 2 decades earlier. She was just 55 years old. After battling cancer for years, her final days were spent away from public view, surrounded by only a few who remained close to her. Her death was reported in German news outlets, but was not marked by any official ceremony or large public memorial. Yet, even in death, her name stirred powerful emotions. Some saw her as a mother who did what any grieving parent might do, while others viewed her as a symbol of how personal vengeance can challenge the very fabric of justice. The quiet end. Marianne had spent most of her post-prison years moving between countries, attempting to reclaim some form of anonymity. After being released from prison in 1985, she briefly settled in Nigeria, where she married again. However, the marriage didn't last, and she eventually relocated to the United States. Despite the drastic changes in her environment, she couldn't escape her past. Every time someone recognized her name, the questions returned. Over time, the media interest in her life waned, but she remained a figure of curiosity and moral debate in Germany. She rarely gave interviews, and when she did, she spoke cautiously, often deflecting questions about whether she felt remorse or justification. As her health declined, she returned quietly to Lübeck in the early 2000s. Friends described her as reclusive, often staying indoors and avoiding crowds. The woman once at the center of national attention now lived a life of near total isolation. The press and public reaction. When news of her death broke in 2006, German newspapers published reflective pieces. Some revisited the courtroom shooting, others examined the broader social response to her act. A few questioned whether the justice system had failed her, while others emphasized the dangers of vigilante action. The headlines varied, some compassionate, some critical, but they all acknowledged the deep public resonance of her story. The German public, too, remained divided. For many, she was an icon of maternal love pushed beyond its limits. For others, she represented a dangerous precedent, one where grief turned into murder, and murder into spectacle. Still, the vast majority agreed on one point. Her story had permanently entered Germany's legal and cultural memory. Legacy in media and culture. The story of Marianne Bachmeier didn't die with her. Over the years, her case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and podcasts. Her courtroom shooting has been recreated in dramatized television segments, examined in criminology discussions, and dissected in ethics classes. One of the most widely watched documentaries, aired on German television in the late 1990s, featured never-before-seen footage from the courtroom and in-depth interviews with key figures from the case. It reignited national debate. In the years that followed, more analytical works emerged, some focusing on the emotional toll of the crime, others on the societal implications. Her story has even influenced fictional narratives. Characters loosely based on her have appeared in novels and crime series. The emotional weight of her actions, committed in a courtroom, in front of the justice system she no longer trusted, remains a haunting symbol of blurred lines between personal justice and legal authority. Legal and ethical impact. Beyond culture, Marianne's actions had a tangible effect on German courtroom procedures. Security in courtrooms was tightened after the shooting. The fact that she had managed to smuggle in a small pistol, sit through hours of trial proceedings, and then open fire in front of judges, lawyers, and journalists shocked legal institutions. Reforms were introduced to improve checks at court entrances and increase awareness of high-risk cases. Ethically, her case continues to be studied in law schools and philosophy departments. Was it an act of justice or a failure of it? Could a parent ever be truly objective in the face of such trauma? Should emotional context lessen criminal liability? These are questions that her case continues to provoke. Some legal scholars argue that her relatively light sentence, 6 years, of which she served only 3, was a silent admission by the system of its own failure. Others maintain that regardless of emotional suffering, murder remains murder. But in Marianne's case, that line was deeply contested. Psychological legacy. Marianne's case also sheds light on the psychological aftermath of trauma. Testimonies from psychologists during her trial and interviews later revealed the immense internal conflict she lived with. She suffered from long-term PTSD, unresolved grief, and deep trust issues. Her act in the courtroom wasn't premeditated in the traditional sense. It was driven by rage, desperation, and helplessness. For years, she battled guilt, even though some praised her as a heroine. Her story has since been used in studies exploring what profound grief can do to a person's mind. It serves as a cautionary tale, not just about revenge, but about how systems need to support victims and survivors, especially those navigating the traumatic aftermath of violent crimes. Final reflection. Justice or tragedy? Even now, almost 2 decades after her death, the question remains: was it justice or a tragedy in disguise? Those who see justice in her actions argue that the system failed to protect her daughter, failed to punish Klaus Grabowski adequately in the past, and failed to prevent a preventable murder. In that view, Marianne did what the law should have. But others see tragedy. A woman pushed beyond her limits, consumed by grief, left to face the ruins of a life she never asked for. They argue that her courtroom act, while emotionally understandable, undermined the very structure of justice and risked turning courts into battlegrounds for personal vengeance. In the end, Marianne Bachmeier's story is not a clean moral tale. It is a deeply human one. It reveals what happens when law, emotion, trauma, and justice collide. And it reminds us that sometimes the truth isn't about right or wrong, but about what pain does when it has nowhere else to go.